Welcome to today's ACLU Town Hall on the Supreme Court's latest term, which just ended last week. I'm Michael Popak, a national trial attorney, a co-founder and host of the Legal AF podcast and YouTube channel on the Midas Touch Network, which is live streaming this important conversation tonight, and a proud ACLU partner and supporter. And I'm honored to moderate today's conversation with four of the ACLU's top legal and policy experts. Over the next hour, we will dig into the historic victory obtained by the ACLU on birthright citizenship and the powerful message it sends to President Trump, and two devastating decisions that directly impact voters this midterm election season and the future of Title IX and civil rights protections for transgender youth. Throughout our discussion, a common theme will emerge: the role that you play, because the rule of law and the Constitution don't enforce themselves. People do, lawyers do, voters do, protesters do, followers of independent media do, and public interest groups like the ACLU do. And the ACLU needs our support to keep fighting until all of our rights are secured. Let's start this important conversation by welcoming on the ACLU's National Executive Director, Anthony Romero, and National Legal Director, Cecilia Wong. Hi, Cecilia. Hi, Anthony.
Hello, Michael.
Let's start it with a heartfelt congratulations on this landmark win at the United States Supreme Court, 6-3, to ensure that no president denies citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil. We, the collective we, the people, were troubled when the court took up the case at all. And yet you were able, through force of argument and legal analysis and Cecilia's riveting oral argument, to get 6 justices to agree to protect birthright citizenship. Bravo.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Anthony, I know you were a few feet away from President Trump, who attended the oral argument.
I was.
Yeah.
One row behind him.
And you, and you made a promise to President Trump, didn't you?
And I kept it with my colleague, Cecilia Wong.
And what was that promise?
That if he did what he promised to do and take away our rights and our liberties, we would take him to court. And boy, did we ever. And boy, did my colleague, Cecilia Wong, school him in the Constitution.
I mean, on the day one, hours after being sworn in, the president issued his executive order taking direct aim at birthright citizenship. I mean, right out of the playbook right out of his own playbook, right? And within 2 hours, the ACLU filed its first lawsuit challenging him and defending this bedrock guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. What message does the Supreme Court decision send to President Trump?
I think it's a very significant rebuke of one of the president's signature initiatives that he signed on his first day in office. And it was a definitive ruling on the Supreme Court, with 6-3 of the justices ruling in our favor. 5, as you mentioned, on constitutional grounds, and the 6th, Justice Kavanaugh, as Cecilia will explain, on the statutory grounds. But it was definitive. And what was most important was, like, let's back up a second, is that we were preparing for this lawsuit for months before inauguration. In fact, we took him both literally and seriously. When on the campaign stump, he promised to try to reverse birthright citizenship. We did the research, we found the clients, we thought about the venue. And in the days leading up to inauguration, when it was increasingly clear that they would make this first move, our team was ready so that we could file that lawsuit within 2 hours of him signing the executive order on a federal holiday, I would add, on Martin Luther King Day. And so it was incredibly gratifying sitting in the court and watching Cecilia argue the case on behalf of her clients, on behalf of the Constitution, on behalf of the statute. Watching the president fidget, because he was literally 6 feet right in front of me. And so I could see him beginning to get anxious and antsy. And some of the news reports got it wrong. Some of the news reports said that he left before Cecilia argued. That's not true. She got completely through her opening argument and was beginning to field questions. I think the first question was from Justice Thomas and others. And that's when the president just doesn't like to hear bad news. And I would love to have been 6 feet behind him when the decision came down because it was a ringing and stark rebuke. Um, and of course, this term is a mixed bag. We'll get into that. There were cases that broke our hearts and will make serious damage to civil liberties and civil rights, and we'll get into that. But I also think it's important to celebrate the wins and to take the victory lap because it shows that we can put guardrails and parameters on this president's worst policies. And the fact that we were able to convince Chief Justice Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, who was nominated on the court by the president himself, and ultimately Justice Kavanaugh on the statutory grounds, I think was incredibly gratifying. So we're still taking a victory lap, as you can tell. And I think most importantly, the plight of our clients and of hundreds of thousands of immigrants who are born each year, who would have been affected by this birthright citizenship order. As many as 250,000 children could have potentially been denied their right to be a U.S. citizen because of this executive order. And so this has enormous implications, not just knocking out a signature policy statement or one of the first efforts by the president, but it has enormous implications for the lives of literally hundreds of thousands and not millions of people.
Well, I'm glad he sat for Cecilia's riveting oral argument and
It
back and
was
forth
great.
with John Sauer. He had to rush out apparently to fire his attorney general. But in any event, we knew the ACLU was prepared in legal AF world because we had read all your white papers that were up on your website, ready to go right after the election. In fact, I did a lot of my reporting with credit to the ACLU's white papers about what was ahead of us. So I was not shocked at all that within a couple hours you had your suit dusted off and ready to go and filed. Let me turn to Cecilia here. I've interviewed her before on Legal AF. Cecilia, it was a brilliant argument. Share about what was at stake for you. As you know, I'm an oral advocate. I've done cases in front of appellate panels too. As you're preparing, what was going through your mind about what was at stake in this case?
Thank you so much, Michael and Anthony. I would talk about the stakes in three ways. The first thing, of course, as Anthony already said, is that the good estimates gave us a number of 250,000 US born babies who, in the first year, if the president's executive order had gone into effect, would have been stripped of their US citizenship. And some of those children would have possibly been stateless. And so all of those parents who are both lawfully, present immigrants and undocumented immigrants who've been contributing to US communities for many years, were in a state of uncertainty. And this promise that had been made about birthright citizenship in the 14th Amendment was up in the air. So those were the immediate stakes, all of the families, US families who were affected by the executive order. On the second level were the greater stakes that were very much on my mind as a 14th Amendment citizen. My parents were not yet naturalized when I was born. And, even though the president's order only went after people who don't have one parent who is a lawful permanent resident or a US citizen, and even though the executive order was going to take effect on the effective date a month after the issuance of the order, if the president got his way in this Supreme Court case, of course, who would he go after next? And so there were much broader stakes that if the president can reinterpret the 14th Amendment's citizenship clause as to this executive order, we don't know where he's going to go next or where any future president might go. And then the third thing I was thinking about in terms of the stakes are that it meant so much for all of us immigrants' rights advocates, civil rights advocates, those of us who have the legacy of free Black Americans who, notwithstanding what President Trump thinks, fought for birthright citizenship for everyone, not just for formerly enslaved African Americans, for everyone born in this country. And what it showed was that when we fight, when we take on the President of the United States, who is doing something unlawful, who is doing something unhinged, we can win. As you and Anthony both said, we've been preparing for this lawsuit since January of 2024. It actually goes back farther than that, when this was just an extreme far-right fringe theory that popped up in state legislatures in the early 2010s or late 2000s. The ACLU was looking at those state bills and advocating against them. So it was, the stakes were enormous, and the stakes for millions and millions of Americans were enormous, because birthright citizenship belongs to all of us.
Absolutely. Was there anything surprising to you during the oral argument? I mean, I guess another way to ask, when did you know you had 5 votes?
Well, as it
Or
turns
6?
out, the oral argument is a little hard to read. One lesson, I think most people, based on the oral argument, thought that we might have at least 7 votes. In a way, we did, since Justice Gorsuch, in his separate opinion, says that he thinks that the president's executive order is probably unconstitutional as to undocumented immigrants, but not as to temporary visitors. I don't like to count my chickens before they're hatched. I thought that the oral argument boded well. The justices' questions boded well for our side. But, you don't know that you win until you win. And, what surprised me, I guess one thing I would share with our listeners is that, you prepare for Supreme Court arguments and you're ready to answer the most complex, the most arcane questions. Here, there are all these bodies of law, the English common law of nationality, the framing history of the 14th Amendment, the statutory history of this statute that Congress enacted. And so I was ready to get into really complex legal arguments. But most of the arguments stayed on the level that ordinary Americans can understand. And part of the audience, obviously our main audience in a Supreme Court argument, are the 9 justices. But in this case, because of those high stakes, it was all of the American people. And so that was, I thought, an interesting part of the experience of arguing it.
Absolutely. I think it's a good time to bring in Deirdre Schiefling, who's the Chief Political and Advocacy Officer for the ACLU. Hi, Deirdre.
Hello. Great to be with you.
Absolutely. So you get a great win by your team here, and now it gets turned over to you. We all know that the fight for immigrants' rights is far from over with this administration. That attack on birthright citizenship was part of a broader billion-dollar effort to tear families apart and terrorize our communities. So I'd love to analyze that birthright win through this lens. What does it take for us to continue winning and protecting immigrant communities?
Yes, well, we are at a critical moment, as you just said, for immigrant communities across the country who have just been relentlessly targeted and terrorized by this administration at every turn. But over the past several months, we've also seen the incredible courage of all kinds of Americans standing up for their immigrant neighbors and against the abuses of President Trump's deportation efforts. For instance, in the wake of the killings of the protesters Renee Good and Alex Preddy during ICE's Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis, we helped organize millions of people across the country to demand ICE out for good. And it worked. Under public pressure, the administration removed thousands of ICE agents from Minneapolis. And also in response to those kind of protests, many members of Congress fought for months to put stronger guardrails on ICE. So protest works as one way to protect our immigrant neighbors. In the run-up to oral arguments in the birthright citizenship case, on April 1st, we had close to 400,000 people sign our petition in support, and hundreds of people rally outside the court to protect birthright citizenship and the 14th Amendment. I think the tide is turning on this issue. Support for this president's extreme and cruel immigration agenda is at an all-time low, with recent data showing 61% of Americans view his handling of immigration unfavorably. And 2/3 of the country, a whopping 66%, express little to no confidence in Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And in fact, a majority of Americans think this administration is doing entirely too much to deport immigrants who are living here. So we at the ACLU are working to turn that public opinion into concrete rights by working with our ACLU affiliates in states and cities to pass real protections in their own communities through an effort that we call Firewall for Freedom. We're working with governors, attorneys generals, state legislatures, and since President Trump's inauguration, ACLU affiliates have worked with their elected officials to pass 145 protections for rights, about half of which are about immigrant rights, protecting immigrant rights, including things like bans on coordination between ICE and local law enforcement, accountability bills for federal overreach, and community trust acts. And laws like this are so important because they really stop local police from acting as a force multiplier for ICE, and they preserve the community trust that keeps everyone safe and keeps us feeling like we are in a community with each other. But while state-by-state protections are good and they're what we can do right now, the only real and permanent solution is to overhaul our immigration system. We need a clear path to citizenship for the families who are already here, building lives, paying taxes, contributing to our communities, and we need to reform our enforcement system that has gotten so abused by this administration. Unfortunately, across the country, millions of immigrants who are part of our communities continue to face rampant deportation efforts. And a recent Supreme Court ruling exacerbated that problem even further by paving the way for the administration to strip away legal rights and work authorizations from people who are fleeing violence by terminating something called temporary protected status for 17 countries. This means that more than 1.3 million people who are currently in our country will lose their status in the coming months. In the face of this crisis, our partners at the National TPS Alliance, which is a grassroots coalition led by TPS holders themselves, are fighting to defend these protections. And I know that Cecilia will discuss this Supreme Court case in more detail in just a moment. But the bottom line is this: the public does not want this chaos, this fear. They do not want this mass deportation. Americans are ready for a common sense approach and ready for a fair and functional immigration system. Our organizing and volunteer training capacity at the ACLU are one of our greatest strengths. And to stop mass deportations, to protect our neighbors, and to build community trust from the ground up, we also have to protect our democracy. And we need a massive network of people ready to show up at town halls, at rallies, and at local precincts to defend our communities and hold elected officials accountable. We would love to invite everybody watching right now to join ACLU's People Power. Become a People Power supporter nationwide to defend democracy, support immigrant communities, and protect voting rights. You can sign up right now today to join Democracy Defenders Task Force at aclu.org/Democracy Defenders.
So that's a perfect segue, Deirdre, because what I'm hearing from you is the public has a major role to play to try to bend the Trump administration to its will, right? Through working through the ACLU and otherwise and protesting, right?
That's right.
Yep.
Exactly.
Yep. So I want to turn to Anthony. There's a protest, of course, including the one I think, Deirdre, you organized one while your colleague was inside the Supreme Court arguing. You had a group of people massed outside the Supreme Court in protest, right?
And
That's
there
right.
were
Well, in
thousands.
protest, in support, in support.
In support. What did I say?
That's right.
Against Cecilia. No, in support, of course. Yeah, working hand in glove. So, Anthony, protests, of course, are one visible sign of public
Yeah.
support. Another is this new national ad campaign featuring Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA for the ACLU. What was behind the decision to launch it?
Yeah, it's the idea that if we only make the arguments in courts and in legal courts, and we're not taking this to the streets or the courts of public opinion, we're not going to win the full war. And this is so essential that we have to battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. The American people, I still believe, are a good, fair, justice-minded people. They want to do the right thing for them, for themselves, for their neighbors, for their families, for their loved ones. And so you have to pull people into the debate with you. And like Deirdre said, there's a lot that we've queued up in terms of protests across the country. And I think the pivot that you've seen in the government, walking away from the hard, heavy-handed tactics that you saw in Minneapolis and Los Angeles, to now trying to do it more under the radar with Secretary Markwayne Mullen. There's been an effort to not have these big conflagration moments or these big workplace raids. And they're going to try to push people through the detention deportation machinery in secret and in silence. And so we've got to continue to kind of get this message out in front of people, because you might not have an event like the murder of Alex Preti or the protests in Los Angeles, but yet the impact on immigrant communities is still happening. And so we turned to one of the most iconic singers in America, Bruce Springsteen, who has enormous walkabout and reach to all sorts of people. If you've been to one of his concerts, you've seen people from all walks of life show up. And Mr. Springsteen and his agent, John Landau, gave us the rights to use his iconic song, Born in the USA, a song that most people can hum or kind of sing the chorus to. And we produced a multi-million-dollar ad campaign to demonstrate to the American people what's at stake through visual images, through feelings, through evocative storytelling. And we ran that ad. We ran that ad in that when Cecilia was arguing in the Supreme Court. We spent millions of dollars running that ad. We targeted specifically Mar-a-Lago and the White House and Fox News to make sure that the folks who were turning into that channel were going to see it. I don't know if that was part of the reason why President Trump ended up shuffling his way into the Supreme Court that morning to watch the argument, but causality is impossible for me to prove. But we definitely ran it again when we won. And we ran it to kind of remind people that we did what we promised to do. We protected birthright citizenship. And to remind people that this battle is not over. That even though it's done and decided at the Supreme Court level, that you can see that the president continues to try to keep this alive in the body politic and keep talking about Congress fixing it. Well, Congress cannot fix it. You need a constitutional convention to undo the constitutionality of the 14th Amendment, or you need another Supreme Court case. So it's not going to happen through the courts, but you can see that the president is using this as a rallying cry. And we wanted to use the song, the ad, the stories, the narratives, the feelings that people had, especially around the lead up to July 4th, as a way to say, no, we're fighting for our rights. We're fighting for our birthright. We're fighting for what this country means and the great promises that America has made to generations of immigrants. And it was a lot of fun putting together the ad and then deciding to target certain key geographies to make sure that whenever they turned on the TV at 2 a.m. or earlier, they would see us.
Is there plans to launch the ad campaign again?
We did. We launched it. We launched it all the way to the lead up of July 4th.
Yep.
And look, if they continue to make this an issue for them in the run up to the midterms or in the presidential election, you bet we'll go back and ask Mr. Springsteen to let us keep using that ad.
As long
And I
as
think it just speaks to the hearts and minds of people. And people can say, yeah, I can see that family. I can see that man. I know that person. That's like my neighbor.
Yeah, yeah. I especially was delighted by that. I'm a kid from Asbury Park, New Jersey, so I don't think I've missed a Springsteen concert, including one down in Florida on this current tour where he spent a considerable amount of time talking about and defending immigration rights and supporting local agencies and local groups that were pro-immigration rights. And nobody walked out on him. Nobody. That was not a bathroom break time.
No.
Everybody stood riveted. And then, of course, he launched into Born in the USA. I want to go back to Cecilia here, the court warrior, about the court's ability to hold the line. Clearly, the fight is not over. We've seen the comments that Stephen Miller, laughing on Fox News, made after it about what he may or may not do at the airport with arriving people. Birthright citizenship is just one of those cases. How many immigrants' rights cases have the ACLU filed, for instance, in the last 18 months?
So since the second Trump term began, we have filed 134 immigration cases just against the Trump administration. There are a number of other ones we have filed against state officials who have promulgated anti-immigrant policies.
And I guess our audience is looking for the takeaway. Should that birthright decision that you were able to obtain, should that allay people's concerns about the court's ability to hold the line and protect the rule of law?
Well, yes and no, right? The fact that we won the birthright citizenship case is proof that, as I said earlier, we all can win when we all fight, when we all stand up together for what's right and for the rule of law and for the constitutional promises that were made in the 14th Amendment in this particular case. On the other hand, the fact that it was a 5-4 decision, the fact that President Trump promulgated an executive order as the President of the United States that previously has been a fringe white supremacist policy dream, fever dream. Those things show that our rights are always vulnerable and that we always have to stand up and fight for them. We also see this in the cases we lost this term. In a case that Sophia Lynn Lakin's going to talk about in a moment, Louisiana versus Callais, in a case that we did challenging the Secretary of Homeland Security's revocation of temporary protected status for Syrians and Haitians. And in our case of BPJ and Hecox, challenging these state laws that target transgender young people who simply want to play sports like others, everyone else does. In all three of those cases, the court turned our basic promise of equal protection of the laws on its head. In the case of Calais, they took something that's meant to protect politically vulnerable minorities and empowered majorities to trample on the rights of minority voters, in this case, the Black voters of Louisiana. And in these other cases too, the court just got the analysis wrong, didn't follow its past precedents, ignored clear evidence of discriminatory effects when these laws are enacted. And so the lesson is that we've got to always defend our rights, and we have to defend the rights of those among us who are the least politically powerful. That is what we do as civil rights advocates.
And Cecilia, what's the track record so far with all the cases that have been filed? I know some of them haven't gone to full conclusion, but how's the ACLU doing defending the rights in these cases?
So if you take a look at all of the Trump cases we filed against the Trump administration since January of 2024, January 2025, we have, by our measure, which is, did we delay a Trump policy from going into effect? Did we stop a Trump policy from going into effect? At some stage, we've prevailed in 83% of our cases. And among the cases that we have concluded in the lower courts, our success rate there is also coincidentally 83%. So it just goes to show that with the support of all of our members and all of you out there, we can win when we fight. We still win cases in the Supreme Court as well by deploying strategies such as finding alliances with unlikely partners, trying to find cross-ideological, cross-partisan efforts with amicus briefs or even in representing parties in the court, including in a due process and Second Amendment case this term, we can win. And those cases have reverberations for the future. So yeah, I'm pretty pleased with our track record so far. The fights are always worth it.
Absolutely. Even in dissents, if you're getting a powerful dissent like a Justice Kagan or a Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, some people in my audience ask, well, what does it matter? They were on the losing end of it. It does matter because it shows up in other cases. We have cases that have come out where federal judges refer to the dissent and the analysis there to on their issues. So even dissents matter if you're getting such powerful ones as we just saw. Anthony, let me ask you, Chief Justice Roberts, when he penned the Birthright Citizenship, he has that one line in there that's been repeated a few times. To be a citizen is the right to have rights.
Right.
And yet, in other cases, those rights seem to have been trampled on by this United States Supreme Court. How do you square the birthright win against the setbacks in redistricting and trans justice, which we'll dive into shortly?
It's a mixed bag, as Cecilia has been saying, and as she schooled me as our top lawyer at the ACLU. I have a bunch of degrees, but I leave the lawyering to our very best lawyers to argue the cases that are really high stakes. And I would just say that the court, I think, has demonstrated its willingness to circumscribe uh, President Trump's unlawful or unconstitutional policies, right? You've seen it in Birthright. You saw it in the tariff case. You saw it in the Lisa Cook case. You saw it earlier this year when they denied the right to deploy the National Guard in cities against the interests or the statements of the governors. So in four major initiatives, they have put guardrails on the president. Now, we should not be fooled, though, to thinking that therefore they align with us. They are inherently a conservative Supreme Court, the majority, 6-3, continue to think not always in alignment with the ACLU on issues like voting rights or LGBT rights or racial justice issues. And that's where we have to think out of the box. And that's where we have to think expansively. That's why good lawyers find ways of making arguments that bring people along. And Sophia, we'll talk to you, Sophia Lynn-Lakin, who's the head of our Voting Rights Project. There was a major win on a voting rights case in the last week of the court on mail-in ballots, right? It was important that we were able to make that argument that didn't just rely upon liberal or progressive arguments, but it also actually would bring in conservatives. And that's what we have to continue to do, even as we're clear-eyed and knowing that the deck, if you count them up just ideologically, there are 6 more conservative justices versus 3 that are more liberal versus progressive. And so we've got to be very smart about which cases we file and where we fight out in the Supreme Court, how we take the long view and how we lay the groundwork for coming back at this. And sometimes you just have to bring the case because it's the right case to bring, because the equity is involved and your clients want you to advocate on their behalf. And if we won every case we filed, we wouldn't be filing all the right cases. We have to push the envelope. We have to think about where the law needs to be in 10 or 20 years and not just at the end of June or July. And so we play the long game. We've been around for 106 years. We'll be on it like water on stone.
And Anthony, tell us about the Guardian of Liberty. I
Those are the
saw that
folks who
going through the ACLU's website. Tell me
So
about
those are the folks who make monthly contributions. Look, I spend a lot of my time chasing wealthy individuals, some of whom run away from me now because they either believe in Donald Trump or they're afraid of Donald Trump. Thank God for the rank and file of this organization, the card-carrying members, as George Bush called them. And the best of our members. We love them all equally, but my most favorite, I love them a little more than the others, are the ones who make monthly contributions. And partly because even if it's a small dollar amount, $5, $10 a month, it's resources we can rely upon so that I can say to Cecilia, go hire another 5 immigrants' rights lawyers because I know I have sustainers who are making monthly contributions. And so, people should really sign up. They told me to make sure I make it. It's aclu.org/go monthly and small amounts of money, but like water on stone, I promise you we'll put it to good use and we'll have an overall impact for that work going forward.
Absolutely. I think this is a good transition moment to discuss that Supreme Court's redistricting decision in Calais versus Louisiana. Deirdre, thanks for joining us. I think we're going to bring in one of your colleagues now. We're going to bring in Sophia Lynn Lakin, who is the Voting Rights Project Director for the ACLU for this particular discussion, and to stay here with, actually, I think Deirdre's going to stay, right? I think actually, Deirdre, you're going to stay. Sorry
I'm
about
gonna
that.
stay.
I didn't mean to cut you loose before necessary. Of course, we got a great ASL interpreter as well here with us. So let me start with Sophia about redistricting. Look, we don't sugarcoat things here. As we say on Legal AF, we don't blow smoke or sunshine. This term, the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act in a major setback. What does the fight for fair maps, congressional maps, look like today following that decision in Calais?
Michael, you've said it. There's no sugarcoating it. Callais dealt a massive blow to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, our most important tool for stopping racially discriminatory maps. For 6 decades, that law is what turned the promise of the 14th and 15th Amendments into something real. The reason voters of color could actually elect candidates of their choice. And that representation was never symbolic. It's whether your kid's school gets funded, whether your neighborhood gets flood relief. That's what Callais put at risk. Justice Kagan, and you mentioned these dissents, and her dissent said the decision renders Section 2 all but a dead letter. In plain terms, the court has opened the door wide to the kind of district maps this country had before the Voting Rights Act. It will change the literal face of representation in America. This is a profound setback, and I won't pretend otherwise. But what gets lost in the headlines is that Calais was only about Section 2 and in redistricting. That's one tool in one context. It didn't end the fight, and it didn't touch every other tool we have. We're still fighting under Calais' new standards. We're going to continue to do that. But there's also the Constitution itself, and with it, claims of intentional discrimination. When a state draws a map to strip Black voters of power on purpose, that's unconstitutional, and we'll make that record. We have state constitutions, many of which protect the vote more strongly than the federal one. And we have a growing number of states that have their own voting rights acts, laws that don't rise and fall in lockstep with the federal statute. Now, I'll be straight with you. Most of the fights in the courts in the immediate aftermath of Calais, we haven't won, at least not yet. But a case you haven't won isn't a fight that you've lost. The ink on Calais wasn't even dry when states across the South began suspending primaries, forcing through new maps, trying to lock in the damage before anyone could stop them. We fought to disrupt them at every turn. And where we couldn't stop them outright, the threat of litigation became more than a lawsuit. It became an organizing moment, a reason for people to show up, to name what was happening, and to shame the legislators using this ruling as cover for a raw power grab against voters of color. In Louisiana, the organizing and the threat of litigation are a big part of why the legislature pulled back from going all the way, settling for a map that keeps one district where Black voters can elect their candidate of choice instead of wiping out representation entirely. That's hundreds of thousands of people who kept a voice they were about to lose. In South Carolina, the legislature walked away from its redraw entirely, driven mostly by organizers, but the threat of litigation was cited too. That's what holding the line looks like right now. Not every fight won, but everyone made costly, slowed down, and dragged into the light. no generation in this fight for voting rights has ever gotten to see the end of it. The people who fought and bled for the Voting Rights Act knew it would have to outlast them. That's the work we inherited, and it's ours to carry now. So the fight is certainly harder than it was before Calais, but harder doesn't mean over. And we faced long odds before, and we're certainly not standing down now.
The Supreme Court's decision in Calais, it further stoked fears about the midterms. That's probably the number one thing my audience asks me about or expresses their anxiety, which range from targeted, what about voter intimidation at the polls, to global, will we even have an election? I want to ask both of you individually, how can we safeguard the midterms from interference? Let's start with Deirdre.
Yeah, I mean, this is the question of the moment for sure. The Callais decision was a heavy blow, as Sophia just laid out, and the threats of voter intimidation are real. When the Supreme Court issues a ruling like Louisiana versus Callais and severely weakens Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, it really makes people wonder if the rules can be rewritten right before an election. Are there rules? Are our votes safe? Will our votes count? So we have also heard this from a number of our supporters in states across the country who are very worried about this. But we at the ACLU are not waiting around to see what happens. And we are not hoping, we are preparing. We've launched our largest ever election safeguarding initiative, investing more than $24 million specifically to protect everyone's right to vote, to ensure that all votes are counted and the results are respected. And we've done things like anticipated 25 different election threat scenarios, all the different ways that an election could be threatened or sabotaged, whether it's voter roll purges, intentional delays in processing ballots and counting, or refusal to accept results. In each scenario, we are ready to mobilize and launch legal, advocacy, and communications actions at a moment's notice. We are getting ready so that we can act quickly. We are also addressing the very real fear of voter intimidation at the polls with an organized network of highly trained volunteers. Our People Power program, our People Power volunteer program, which is already 1 million strong and growing, is what makes this possible. And through this People Power program, we are currently training 10,000 volunteers across the country to teach their own communities about their voting rights, to serve as nonpartisan poll monitors, and to actively protect fair and free elections in their communities. Volunteers will be on the ground to ensure that voters can cast their ballots safely and without interference. The ACLU will have a presence in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., with a key focus on 7 battleground states where we know extra protections are going to be critical. We're also holding Know Your Rights trainings and distributing materials nationwide so that every citizen knows exactly what their rights are, how to spot interference, and what to do if they face an issue at their election site. We're building a sustainable and community-based organizing network that remains well past Election Day. And that network is designed to rapidly mobilize tens of thousands of people whenever democracy is threatened. Sophia gave an example of South Carolina. They backed down in part because hundreds of people were staking out their state legislative capital and watching them and telling them not to do the wrong thing. So that kind of public pressure works. We know that this year, more than any year before, fair and free elections will take all of us. We invite you to join ACLU People Power nationwide, become a People Power supporter to defend democracy and protect voting rights. We will train you, we will connect you with opportunities to fight voter suppression, expand access to the ballot, and ensure everyone's voice is heard. Sign up today to join the Democracy Defenders Task Force at aclu.org. /democracy defenders.
Thank you, Deirdre. Let me turn to Sophia. Can you speak to the litigation component and the talk about the track record in protecting voting rights?
Yeah, Deirdre told you about how we're preparing and organizing and how all of you can help protect our voting rights. We're, of course, also ready to go to court at every step before, during, and after the vote, wherever someone could come between a voter and the outcome they chose. We've got templates, the research, the partners, and the litigation plans built in advance, monitors trained to document and raise the alarm, and lawyers across our 54 affiliate network ready to move for swift relief. As we like to say at the ACLU, we don't get ready, we stay ready. And right now, that means that we've already taken more than 80 legal actions in over 24 states. So I just want to flag, I know that after Calais, it's easy to worry about the courts when it comes to voting rights, but redistricting was one fight. Look at the others, and here's what you'll find. We're winning. Just last week, Anthony mentioned this. In a case called Watson, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge that would have thrown out timely cast mail ballots received after Election Day. These voters did everything right. They followed the rules and mailed their ballots on time. They shouldn't lose their voice because a postal truck ran late. Now they won't. States decide how to count their ballots, and that authority is intact leading into November. On the big threat that's on everyone's mind, an administration willing to weaponize federal power against voters, we're already fighting back. President Trump issued executive orders trying to seize control over how states run elections. We sued, and a federal judge permanently struck down the president's attempt to mandate a show your papers voter registration requirement because the president has no power under the Constitution to set the rules for our election. A separate ruling declared unconstitutional the president's attempt to turn the Postal Service from a neutral mail carrier into an arbiter of who can vote by mail. And when the DOJ went to court for voters' sensitive personal data in 30 states and DC, we took legal action in 25 of those cases. And of the 11 courts to rule so far, all have sided with the voters. I want to pause just for a second here on one thing I know that folks are worried about, and that's the federal agents showing up where voters are. So let me be direct here. Intimidating voters is illegal, no matter who's doing it or what uniform they're wearing. And armed federal agents at the polls are flat out barred by federal law. We're ready if anyone tries, monitors on the ground documenting in real time, and lawyers ready to go to court fast if that's what it takes. These attacks on voting rights that also flag are also playing out state by state, and we're meeting them there too. In New Hampshire, we beat back a show you papers requirement there. In Montana, we stopped an effort to end same-day registration, a lifeline in particular for Native American communities, and there's more to come. Here's what I know. We've already won in court this year, more than once, and we're not slowing down. The threats are coming from every direction, from Washington, from state houses, from anyone who thinks they can get between a voter and their ballot. To all of them, the message is simple. Cross the line, and you won't just get a statement from us. You'll see us in court.
Well, I know our audience is going to sleep better at night knowing that you're on the case along with the others at the ACLU. So pleased to have, of course, Deirdre Schiefling here and Sophia Lynn Lakin for the ACLU. We're going to continue the conversation, but with Cecilia Wong and Anthony Romero about transgender rights. Thank you for being here on this roundup. So now we got to talk about BPJ versus West Virginia, started by a young girl who just wanted to play sport. I think she was on the track and field team. There's always a person behind these cases. And now we have the result, the second year in a row that the Supreme Court has sided with state-based efforts to restrict the rights of transgender people and their families, access to healthcare, speech, and in this case, the ability to play sports. Cecilia, what's your team's interpretation of that ruling? What did we lose? And more importantly, what didn't the court decide? Where do we go from here?
Michael, the stakes in West Virginia versus BPJ were really great, just like in all of our cases at the Supreme Court. As you said, our client Becky was a little girl who knew very early on that she was transgender. And she, as a result of medical treatment that her parents and her physicians supported, never went through an endogenous male puberty. She was a little girl like every other little girl. And when she was in middle school, wanting to run cross country and participate in track and field in her middle school, her state of West Virginia enacted a statute that took away her right to participate in school sports in public school. And she was, to our knowledge, the only person in the state of West Virginia who was affected by this law. Our other client, Lindsay Hecox, who was trying to participate in club sports, club soccer and club track and field at Boise State University in Idaho, same thing. The whole state was ramping up against a solitary person who was just trying to play sports, be outdoors, and enjoy the camaraderie of being on a team. And the Supreme Court, of course, issued a decision on the last day of the term where we lost, where the court held that that state law in West Virginia and state law in Idaho did not violate Title IX, the federal anti-discrimination statute that applies to education, and that it didn't violate the Equal Protection Clause. So this is one of the cases this term where the Supreme Court really, warped its prior precedents in order to reach this decision. Now, in a way, the silver lining of the case is that the court had a very cabined ruling. And Justice Kavanaugh, writing for the majority, was careful to say this is about sports, which is a unique context because it's zero sum, because there are winners and losers, and because there are a limited number of spaces on every team that a transgender girl might want to participate in. But at bottom, the Supreme Court's decision is one that says that unlike cisgender people, transgender people don't have the same rights not to be discriminated against by their state government. The silver lining, the other silver lining I would mention is that when we got this terrible news that we had lost the case, one of our colleagues got in touch with Becky and her mother, Heather. And I just wanted to share that what Heather said, what the two of them did to respond was extraordinary. Heather said, number one, Becky now knows that her calling in life is to advocate on behalf of other trans children and youth. The second thing she said is, thank you to the legal team because you gave Becky 8 seasons of cross country and track and field. And that was the highlight of her middle school and high school years. That matters, and it shows that when we fight these cases, even if we lose at the end of the day, that the fight matters for people and has real consequences. So I want to thank everyone for supporting our work in this area.
And Anthony, for the transgender community who's tuning in today, what do you want them to know?
Oh, I want them to feel that we see them and we got them. This is not some small issue for us. This is not some fringe issue. This is not some special interest issue. This is a core issue. We are the American Civil Liberties Union. It don't get more basic than that. You decide what you want to do with this body that has been given to you. You get to decide how you speak. You get to decide with whom you associate, with whom you protest, with whom you love and live and devote your life to. You get to decide how you present yourself to the world. It is a core libertarian promise that I decide what I do with myself. And so we ain't ever giving up. And we will be on it for as long as it takes. And we see the transgender community, the young person in my life, Dylan, we got you. There's no way. And we will keep at it. And yeah, the court broke our hearts, but we will find redemption in the long game. There also were some wins on the transgender rights issue. 3 years, 4 years ago, Bostock was an important case where the Supreme Court upheld the employment rights of a transgender person. So we've got work to do. We've got some cleanup to do, but we've got some justice to serve, and we'll stay on it.
Yeah, that's that makes, I think, not just the transgender community feel better. I think it makes all Americans feel better to hear that coming from the head of the ACLU. Cecilia, next term, it used to be I would take the summer off talking about the United States Supreme Court. Remember those days? And you'd say, I'll see you
Yes,
back in
no
September
longer.
for no. So putting aside the shadow docket and the emergency applications that we know is a strategy and tactic of the Trump administration, with the new term opening in October, they're already selecting cases for it. What should we watch out for?
So we already have one case that the Supreme Court will hear in the fall. It's a case concerning a mandatory immigration detention statute. This is a statute we've litigated twice to the Supreme Court in the past. And this case is really a major one. It presents the issue of whether someone who is being detained pending their deportation proceeding has any rights under the Due Process Clause of the Fifth Amendment to a hearing where an immigration judge can determine whether they pose a flight risk or a danger so that they should be detained. The government has taken the position, really, I think for the first time since this statute was enacted in 1996, that someone in the position of this immigration detainee does not have a fundamental liberty interest in not being locked up by the federal government while they're fighting their deportation case. It's a major case, and that has already been taken up by the court and will be argued in the fall. We are also likely to see our cases challenging state laws in Texas. Other states have also passed these laws that require the posting of the King James Version of the Ten Commandments in every public school classroom in the state of Texas. There are some similar laws in Louisiana and Arkansas. We litigated those cases and we'll be filing a petition to have the Supreme Court take up those cases next term as well. And we have a variety of other immigration cases that are likely to hit the court's docket next term.
Great. And Legal AF will have everybody on to talk about all those cases in real time as they develop. For Anthony, where do you need us, knowing the key role that the broader ACLU community of supporters and activists and volunteers, everything we've talked about today about ways to get involved, where do you need us?
We need you on the playing field. This is not a time to tune out. This is not a time to sit back. This is not a time to resign yourself. And we need to make this a peer-to-peer effort to get everyone engaged. Look, I get tired too. I get fed up. I get frustrated. I read these opinions. I talk to our clients. My heart breaks. And I keep thinking, God, I can't believe we're still at this all these years later. And then I have people in my life, like my mother-in-law, took me last night to a No Kings demonstration. And like the last thing I want to do after working 12 or 14-hour days is to go to another part of my work life. But it was great. And we went there and I heard the leaders of Indivisible speak, and everyone was inspired and fired up. We need to fire each other up. We can let each other take a break, take a nap, but then you got to get people off the sofa, got to get them engaged, got to make sure you vote. Do not skip this election. Of all the elections, this is not the one to skip. Make sure you get trained. Make sure you hand out Know Your Rights materials. Make sure you tell members of your community what you're expecting of each other. Engage the body politic. Engage the process. I mean, democracy can be a lot of things. It should never be quiet, right? So let's make this as loud and as raucous and as hotly contested as the values deserve, because what we're fighting for is really worth all of that.
Absolutely. Democracy is a participatory sport, and I'm so glad that the ACLU is out there leading it for us. I want to thank Anthony and Cecilia and Deirdre and Sophia for having this conversation with me, this briefing for our audience. And of course, thank you to our audience who joined us today. We'll be watching this later on video repeat. I think what you're hearing is that the ACLU is here for you. They are by your side. They need your help. And there are so many different ways to get involved. You can go into the links below. You can go to the ACLU website and you can find a way in any way, whether it's a donation or it's actually becoming a volunteer or to get trained. Do that today. They make that a part of your day. I'm so glad that everybody is here. I'm Michael Popak for Legal AF. You are here on the Supreme Court Roundup with the American Civil Liberties Union.